Today we can draw your attention for a couple of hours to the 1-year anniversary of the signing of the cessation of hostilities and the situation, particularly in Tigray and northern Tigray. I know everybody is quite distracted with a number of other conflicts, but we've got a great lineup today. A few housekeeping items before I introduce Ambassador Van Schaak. For those of you here at Open Society, there are some snacks. Please feel free to get up and enjoy those. The bathrooms are to the right and then to the left. For those of you at home, I'm not going to presume to tell you where your bathrooms are. I hope you know where they are. We would request no wandering around if you are here. If you do need something, though, there's a number of us OSF staff who are here who are happy to direct you. We're going to kick off today with 10 minutes of remarks from Ambassador Beth Van Schaak, who I have known in both writing, intellect, and person prior to her current appointment. If I'm not mistaken, she is the 6th U.S. ambassador in this important position, sworn in March 2022, which is actually rather quick for confirmation. Congratulations. We are very pleased to have you in this role. She's been a long ally on issues around atrocities, abuse, prosecution, accountability, and transitional justice. And it does make me sleep better knowing you're there at night trying to fight the good fight and do the things that many of us are trying to do on the outside. Ambassador Van Schaak traveled to Ethiopia in August 2022, and I hope today she'll give us a little flavor of how that went, but also how that continues to impact some of the things that they're working on now at the State Department. We will hear from her for 10 minutes, and then we will turn to our first panel, which looks at the cessation of hostilities. Ambassador Van Schaak will not take questions, but we'll stay here for panel number 1, which we're thrilled to have. Thank you, everyone, and over to you, Ambassador.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for that kind introduction. And I do wish you were in the belly of the beast with me, but you're not, and you're doing amazing work here. So the universe has placed you where it wants you to be. Right. So glad to have you here, and thank you for inviting me. I was in Ethiopia in August with my colleague Lucy, who's here with me, who then went on a long-term detail with a special envoy for the Horn of Africa. So she's been several times, and my deputy has also been several times. And so I'm drawing on our collective observations and experiences in delivering these remarks this morning. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and with the other distinguished panelists to mark the 1-year anniversary of the Pretoria Agreement and to discuss the current state of human rights, but also transitional justice in Ethiopia. And Sarah, as you mentioned, it really is, I think, an inflection point for this process. And so a great time to do a sort of stock taking as we're doing here. Where have we come? Where do we need to go? And how do we get to where the country needs to be able to put a history of violence behind it and move into a more prosperous, inclusive future? So as we all know, northern Ethiopia was devastated by the recent conflict. Hundreds of people lost their lives, lost their homes. There was widespread violence, including really horrific, and I guess all sexual violence is horrific, but mass sexual violence experienced by those people. When the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement was signed a year ago under the auspices of the African Union with IGAD, the United Nations, and the United States present, it silenced the guns in the north and mostly brought about peace in the region and an end to a terrible war. The Cessation of Hostilities Agreement was a symbol of hope for Ethiopians across the country, but particularly in that region, but also for the rest of us who really yearn for peace and security in that larger region. However, we also know that this was a starting point for another long and difficult process to account for the war crimes and crimes against humanity that occurred on all sides in the war in northern Tigray, in northern Ethiopia. Over the last year, we have seen significant progress in some areas. There has been a dramatic decrease of human rights abuses in Tigray. In other areas, however, and unfortunately, much more needs to be done. Violence continues today in too many regions of Ethiopia, including in Amhara and Oromia. And I hope that we can discuss today how to address these concerns and how to make the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement a vehicle for inspiring and instantiating a more nationwide peace. I want to focus my remarks today on the transitional justice process in Ethiopia. For too long, Ethiopia has experienced cycles of violence, often ethnically based, and perpetuated by impunity. This was the theme of Secretary Blinken's remarks when he visited Ethiopia last March and spoke with President Abe. Ethiopians have never seen a credible or an inclusive, much less a comprehensive transitional justice process. This is a fact that many Ethiopians cited to me in respect to their skepticism about the ability of the government to do proper transitional justice in this particular instance, and current efforts on the justice front more broadly. The enduring situation in Ethiopia is evidence of the fact that there can be no peace without justice. Justice needs to be a part of any transitional process out of conflict and into a more prosperous future. So this is why we were really encouraged that the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement included express commitments to pursue an inclusive and comprehensive transitional justice process by both sides to that agreement. We have an opportunity now to break those cycles of bloodshed and impunity. The victims of atrocities in northern Ethiopia and across the country deserve justice, and I define justice broadly, so broadly define justice. They deserve our support as they rebuild their lives, and they deserve a genuine acknowledgement of the crimes that were committed against them. And the parties to the conflict, the armed actors, all need to take ownership of the atrocities that they committed or that were committed in their name. In this process, those most responsible must be held accountable. Now, since the signing of the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement, the government of Ethiopia has taken some significant steps towards transitional justice. And the United States government, through the State Department, through my office, and through my sister offices, have engaged with government actors, with international experts, many of whom are appearing here today, and with local civil society groups at every step along the way. This process is happening against the backdrop of a larger national dialogue process that isn't about transitional justice per se, but is about a vision for a new Ethiopia that's not riven by ethnic distinctions, but rather has a sense of nationhood, a sense of community together. The government has issued, as we know, public commitments to pursue a credible transitional justice process. They are creating a concrete plan to implement the recommendations and the ideas that were put forth earlier in the so-called green paper that many of you may have seen. This was, I think, quite admirably released for public comment and review. Not every government does that. We received a copy. We were able to give feedback, and that feedback has been integrated into the thinking. They've also pledged to implement the green paper and the new forthcoming plan, which I think is being called a white paper, in good faith. They've also convened multiple consultations around the country with Ethiopians, with Ethiopian leaders, civil societies, but ordinary people as well, with international experts. And the US government in various capacities have attended and supported those events. They've been held throughout the country and also in Addis Ababa. Not nationwide. We realize there are some areas that are not the security conditions didn't allow for those consultations to happen, but we're hopeful that they will be able to be held again in the future so that all Ethiopians have a voice in this future process. However, I want to caution and acknowledge that these public commitments and first steps must be followed by concrete action and more durable reforms. We also understand that many Ethiopians feel that the government, which of course was a party to the conflict, is not capable of undertaking a credible or an even-handed transitional justice process. And in any such process, there are many, many barriers to success, not the least of which is that there are few pathways to envision justice for the Eritreans and the Eritrean forces who themselves were the perpetrators of abuses in the conflict. Furthermore, the sustained political will, of course, will be essential, but as we know from our comparative work, it is often elusive in such post-conflict contexts. There's often an urge to draw a thick black line and to put the past behind us and to move forward. But we know from empirical academic research that that will not instantiate peace, that it will only lead to a return to violence in the future. So again, I will reiterate, there can be no peace without justice. However, we also need to be cognizant of the dearth of other viable options for justice in this context. Many will call for the ICC to take action, but it has no jurisdiction in this matter, absent activity at the Security Council, and that is unlikely to be forthcoming given the current political crisis. There have also been calls for a hybrid court, but we know that that is very hard to establish. There's a tribunal fatigue that has set in within the international community. Again, it might require Security Council action that would not be forthcoming, or the consent of the government. And at this point, the government is wanting to make this process in-house. There may be some opportunistic universal jurisdiction cases that materialize around the world. However, this is not going to be an offer of comprehensive justice. So domestic efforts in Ethiopia are currently the only credible path for any sort of comprehensive transitional justice process. So we as an international community and of friends of Ethiopian and the Ethiopian people cannot let this possibility of justice pass us by without giving it the best possible chance of success. Now is the time to hold the government to its promises in this regard. This is why the United States, including my office, but also our regional desks and our Human Rights Bureau, are continuing to work within this process to try and make it credible and as survivor-centric as possible. It's not going to be perfect. We know that. No transitional justice process is, but we do believe that comprehensive international engagement, including with like-minded partners, with civil society organizations, with human rights groups, and with local leaders within Ethiopia, all of this working together affords the best possibility and opportunity for justice for victims. To be clear, we are not necessarily accepting all of the government's promises at face value. Over the next few months and even years, we will be continuously assessing the process, evaluating its credibility and its success in addressing survivors' needs, and we will be adjusting our engagement accordingly. In particular, and as the next step, we will closely analyze the plan that the Transitional Justice Working Group of Experts will be putting forth in the next couple of weeks. We will be looking to ensure that it addresses the views and needs of victim communities and the public, and include frequent opportunities for public engagement, public input, and comment once the transitional justice process is underway. And in this regard, and I really want to commend this effort, we consumed with great interest the survey data from the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, which surveyed the Ethiopians across the country on what their preferences and expectations for justice are. And I really hope that this will be an iterative process so that we can continually assess the views of Ethiopians as this process unfolds. We will expect that the future plan, once it is released, will include processes to address the main pillars of transitional justice. Of course, this involves truth-telling, accountability, reparations, and various guarantees of non-recurrence, including institutional reforms. The process also needs to integrate gender justice in all aspects, and ensure that women and other historically marginalized communities are able to engage meaningfully in the process. Any plan must include criminal responsibility, particularly for those most responsible and those in positions of command who either ordered the crimes or who failed to prevent them in advance or to punish them after the fact. Trials of these individuals must be conducted according to fair trial guarantees and should include opportunities for victims and witnesses to participate meaningfully if they choose, and to be protected if they do in fact participate. We urge that those who are credibly accused of abuses in the meantime be removed from positions of power pending investigation to demonstrate that allegations are being taken seriously and to eliminate the influence of those implicated in serious international crimes. At the same time, we are also working to continually document the abuses, both past and ongoing, to inform the process, to shed more light on the atrocities that have been committed against civilians, and to inform our own approach to this process. In this regard, we will consider the systemic injustices and ethnic divisions that have contributed to violent consequences for Ethiopians over the many past years. Now, in the next few months, we will work with the government of Ethiopia and our like-minded partners, including African countries that may step forward as guarantors of this process, and also the African Union, which has developed a very sophisticated transitional justice framework, to ensure that the international community is informed about this process and has opportunities to support and to provide expertise and guidance all along the way. This international engagement will be essential to a credible process. And then finally, of course, we have not lost sight of other areas of the country, and we will continue to work for peace in Amhara and Oromia and to advocate for a political process to bring an end to violence across the country. So in closing, please rest assured that we are clear-eyed about the challenges of transitional justice in Ethiopia. This will not be an easy feat. In our view, it is still too early to assess the credibility of the government's transitional justice efforts, notwithstanding criticism that has been leveled against the process by the International Commission for Human Rights Experts in Ethiopia and others. And we take those criticisms and those perspectives very seriously. We understand the skepticism that many people feel, and we share the concerns underlying that skepticism. But we continue to believe that the best chance of a comprehensive and a credible transitional justice process that brings some peace to the people of Ethiopia rests in the current process underway. And we encourage the international community, civil society, other governments, intergovernmental actors to both support, but continuously scrutinize the process as it unfolds. Ultimately, we know we are, of course, all stronger together. The insights and reporting of civil society actors have been crucial throughout the process. We're extremely grateful for the comprehensive and thorough reporting of the ICHREE, and I look forward to hearing from Steve Ratner later today. All of your work has informed our thinking and our policy and will continue to do so. We also listen to the Ethiopian diaspora and the many voices advocating for a better and more just future for all Ethiopians. So with that, I really look forward to our conversation today. I'm sorry I can't stay the whole morning, but I do look forward to the rest of the conversation for this panel. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll switch these up. That was great. I think we'll be able to integrate a lot of the important comments that you've made and put a lot of things on the table in our first panel. So now I'm going to turn to a fully hybrid panel. For those of you in the room, please pretend that they're sitting right here. They are, in fact, up on the screen. I'm going to do very brief introductions, but you probably know who many of them are. We're going to start with Steve Ratner. He was a commissioner on the UN Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia. We've got Abadir Ibrahim, Associate Director of the Human Rights Program at Harvard Law School. Michael Wold-Mariam, Associate Professor, School of Public Policy, University of Maryland, just up the block. We're going to start with since we're running a little late, I'm going to say 5 to 7 minutes of comments from Steve, then we'll go to Abadir, and then we'll go to Mike, and then we'll take questions both from the audience and from those of you online. I may start with a couple of questions to get us going. I would just ask before we begin that everybody who does ask this question, please do so with respect and with intention to actually have an answer to your question. There'll be plenty of time for discussion and commentary along the way as well. Thank you. Steve, over to you to give us a sense of the findings that you worked on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me at this event. I just met with your New York.
You're muted.
I am not muted. My mute button is off.
We're unmuting you.
I could hear him.
Nope, give us a minute. After all this time, we still run into technological difficulties.
How about now? Yes, can you hear me now? I am not muted on my computer.
Can we do it, folks? Can we do it?
You want me to try again?
I can also hear him pretty clearly.
We can't. Oh, they can hear online, but it's us in the room. Can you give us a minute so those of us sitting in the room, which is not one person, it's not just me. Otherwise, I would say continue.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yep. Give us 2 minutes. We will make this work. In the meantime, those of you in the room who would like to get up and get some coffee, now is your chance. All right, Steve, can you say hello?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you
Okay.
exist in the room. Thank you. Sorry for the delay. Please, Steve, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. I was just with your New York representative on Friday with a meeting with our commission, and it's delightful to be here and to see and to hear Beth's remarks as well. As you know, the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia submitted its final reports in the past month or so. We submitted a mandate report to the Human Rights Council that it included as an annex our note of advice to the Ethiopian government about transitional justice. And then in the following days, we submitted a report on atrocity crime risks, as well as a set of final investigative findings. As far as our investigative findings go, I would urge you to read the report. Honestly, we paint a very grim picture, both pre-COHA and post-COHA. Most of you know the horrors pre-COHA regarding the events in Tigray, so I won't go over our findings except to say that we conclude that the gravest of IHL and IHRL violations took place by the Ethiopian Defense Forces, to a certain extent the Tigrayan forces, and of course by the ENDF. So I won't go into that issue very much. Post-COHA, however, we continue to see violence in the north. Of course, COHA has made a huge difference, but we continue to see Amhara militia and Eritrean troops operating with impunity at the tolerance, but with the tolerance of the government. And of course, as many of you know, we've seen the conflict spread to the Amhara and Afar regions, and with a significant deterioration. We were very concerned about the command post system and what it means for the protection of human rights generally. And we point out in our report how we're concerned about other regions as well. Since it seems as if we're focusing mostly today about transitional justice, I'll talk more about that. That was, of course, the other part of our mandate, was to give advice to the government about transitional justice. As most of you know, other than a short meeting in Addis a week in Addis in July of 2022, we had no contact with the government. They refused to engage with us throughout. And so I don't have the benefit of the many meetings that the US government had. We had basically no responses whatsoever from them. And of course, closing us down was part of their agenda from the very beginning. As far as transitional justice, we had our own assessment based in part on a very successful meeting we had in Nairobi in July, where we invited about 50 people from different ethnic groups around the country, almost all of them from Ethiopia, a few diaspora, to come and give us their perspectives about what they wanted from their future. And there was a uniform sense of mistrust of the ongoing process, of the selectivity of it, of the fact that it wasn't nationwide, of the fact that they hadn't reached out to communities, of the fact that it was not, that people were not free, people felt that they were not free to speak their mind. And we had, and wrote in our report, grave concerns about the existing process. We realize it's the only process that's there. There's not an alternative process. But for us, it's symptomatic of the approach of the government regarding transitional justice, which is to set up mechanisms like the IMTF, like the NDC, and like this consultation process to alleviate outside pressure, which it has succeeded in doing, but not really demonstrating much seriousness internally. And so these mechanisms that exist on paper, such as the IMTF and the NDC, when you peel them back, there's actually much less going on than meets the eye, despite promises from the government. We call this quasi-compliance, quoting a recent book by the Professor Kate Cronin-Furman, which is to set up mechanisms as a strategic way of domestic mechanisms as a strategic way of avoiding international scrutiny, and in terms of the sponsors of the resolution that created the ICHREE, it would appear that this has worked. Our report ended with a variety of recommendations, both for the government and for outside parties. At the request of a number of states, we included a series of benchmarks for what we regarded as the minimal steps for a credible transitional justice process. Some of them Beth mentioned, like the orders to remove certain persons from authority who are implicated in violations, but they go beyond that to start some kind of accountability process now, to cooperate with international and regional mechanisms, to adjust the timelines of the current process, to begin a serious reparations plan, and to acknowledge and apologize for what has happened. And unfortunately, even these minimal steps have not been undertaken. So looking forward, we realize that the onus now falls on member states and on other parts of the United Nations to follow up on our findings. I would say that in this conversation about transitional justice, we should not forget the issue of prevention. We are not just looking back at dealing with past atrocities. There are serious risks of ongoing atrocity crimes that we make clear in our separate report. And so this is not just about transitional justice. There's no transition. There is an ongoing conflict. The priority needs to be on the cessation of the most violent acts, and transitional justice is part of that, but the prevention aspect is equally important for outside actors. And so in this conversation, as we evaluate what Ethiopia is doing about the past violations, let's not forget that we have ongoing violations that also merit our attention. I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Steve. There were a lot of nodding heads in this room when you said there's no transition. I think you give us a lot to think about in terms of the infrastructure and architecture and commitments that have been created, which goes to the ambassador's point about how do we make this credible? And when I say we, I have a very broad definition of we, and obviously includes a number of the affected community and people in the region as well. Let's go to our second panelist, Abadir Ibrahim, please. Give us a second. You're muted, I think.
Thank you, Sarah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that was easy. Go ahead.
All righty. Thank you. And I'd like to start by thanking Refugee International, Open Society, Amnesty International for organizing this event. I would like to also pause and take a moment to thank members of ICHREE and staffers of ICHREE for making the best of a really bad situation. I understand it wasn't easy to write such a sizable report, despite not just the government not being cooperative, but actually being outwardly aggressively against and undermining this process. And it is in this context of the government's actions towards ICHREE that I would like to express skepticism about the transitional justice process that is taking place in Ethiopia. If the government is so opposed to ICHREE, investigating what happened, why do we have a reason to be hopeful about what's going on with the transitional justice process? This reminds me of a moment. This is a turning point. This is a moment, a fork on the road that we're facing. But let me take you to another moment. In May 2022, during another turning point in Ethiopia, there was a 5-month ceasefire that posed the Tigray war. I returned to Addis for a conference. Within minutes of arriving, I encountered a larger than life sculpture of the words #Baka. That's Amharic for no more. It was a remnant of the No More campaign that was waged to stave off international calls for peace and an end to the blockade of Tigray. And my nostalgia for going home quickly dissipated as I recalled what's context within which the No More campaign was taking place. The No More campaign manifested in the front lines, where perpetrators mocked victims, asking them if America or the United Nations was going to spare their lives. The No More campaign at the same time took place on the streets of Addis, Washington, D.C., London, Frankfurt, Paris, and even Kingston, Jamaica, near simultaneous rallies which jeered anyone perceived to oppose the war or human rights violations or call for the end of the blockade. Protesters jeered CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, President Biden, the West, anyone who was demanding an end to war crimes to stay out of Ethiopia. Half an hour later, I arrived at my hotel and turned on the TV and saw a panel discussion where the interviewees were introduced as nominees of the National Dialogue Commission. I couldn't stomach more than 5 minutes of the conversation, which centered almost exclusively on the dangers of foreign intervention in Ethiopia, foreign intervention in the national dialogue process. Over the coming week, in the conference and outside of the conference, I talked to dozens of my colleagues who agreed that the national dialogue process was a public relations ploy. The most generous comment I could find was a combination of a shrug and the words, "Sorry, no comments." The reason I'm starting with that moment is because, like today, that was one of those turning points where people like those in this room and in the audience have to make a choice or even a gamble by jumping on board transitional justice, on board Reconciliation Commission or national dialogue processes. We know that we're providing legitimacy and goodwill. Some of us, technical expertise and financial buoyancy to the process we're talking about. And in exchange for providing legitimacy and goodwill, we hope to get a seat at the table, a possibility to positively influence the process or even the outcome. The question is, do we still provide legitimacy, goodwill, expertise, funding, and so on to a process that we know will not achieve reconciliation, justice, national dialogue, or even might have the opposite effects? Let me remind you that most of us stayed away from many similar processes that we knew were designed to achieve the opposite effect than truth and justice. In 2006, there was a commission of inquiry in Oromia. In 2004, there was a commission of inquiry in Addis Ababa. And there was also in 2004 a commission of inquiry on Gambella. All good examples of a truth and reconciliation or investigation type process that was established to achieve impunity. Even in 2018, most of us stayed away from the Reconciliation Commission, which no longer exists now, knowing that it was designed to fail. Some of us wrote open letters speaking up against it. Some of us tried to reform it. Some of us tried to establish alternative truth and reconciliation processes. All of these processes were thwarted by the government because it did not want transitional justice. And the 2018 Reconciliation Commission took place in a context where the government didn't face the possibility of either prosecution or being shamed, because at that moment, the government that was in power wasn't the one that was being accused of, at least the leaders weren't being accused of gross violations of human rights. I would be interested in hearing what the perspectives of those who are proposing that we jump on to this TRC process and provide legitimacy and goodwill as to why the government would do transitional justice or investigate its own alleged violations when it wasn't interested in doing so, when it didn't face the risk of its leaders being prosecuted or shamed. Now, turning to the ICHREE report, and Sarah, I hope I didn't overshoot my time. Turning to the ICHREE report,
You've got about 2 minutes left.
Okay, excellent. There are two primary conclusions that come out of the ICHREE report. And I'd have to be honest and say that hope or inspiration are not one of those conclusions. Maybe the cessation of hostilities brought relief from imminent collapse, but it does not inspire hope. We have to really be honest. If we're talking about truth and reconciliation, if we're going to use the word truth, we might as well be truthful. There is not a process that inspires hope. The hostilities have continued. That much is clear from the ICHREE report and from other sources as well. Gross human rights violations have also continued despite the Pretoria Agreement. They have continued in Tigray. They have continued in Oromia. And they have a new conflict that started in the Amhara region, and new forms of human rights violations are still taking place. So to talk about transitional justice, where there is no transition, I think is to not take this process seriously. I'm not opposed to transitional justice, but I'm opposed to us starting a process of transitional justice before there is a transition. There needs to be a transition from war to peace, and B, a transition to some sort of a stable governance system in Ethiopia. Without that, we cannot do transitional justice. What we can do is investigate previous and ongoing violations with the hope that one day when a transition does come, we may be in a position to conduct transitional justice. And let me wind down quickly with a call to action to my Ethiopian colleagues, especially to those in the human rights field. This is really a moment to ask ourselves whether we are going to hope that transitional justice will happen by jumping into the process, getting a seat at the table, and somehow hope something good will come out of it, but while providing legitimacy to the process? Or is it time to take a step back and say, look, we have to say no? And my call is for my colleagues in Ethiopia is we have to be able to take a step back, do no harm, and say, no, you know what, we are not going to engage in this process unless XYZ happen. And that XYZ would primarily be a transition. Otherwise, we're just supporting an impunity campaign, or as Steve described it, a campaign of quasi-compliance. And that is something that I think is ethically very difficult. Second, to international actors, I would call on you to take a moment and reflect on what you are doing. This is what I would call in Ethiopia the Obama moment. When President Obama came to Ethiopia and called the Ethiopian government a democratically elected government. Now, we will understand if foreign policy actors in the US, EU, and other countries support Ethiopia for reasons other than human rights, other than democracy. But let's please not take funding and support for democracy and human rights and support a process that achieves the opposite. Let's at least, if we're going to talk about truth, let's be truthful about what we're doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Abdir. I think you put a lot of important points on the table, including the cycles of impunity that Ethiopia has suffered over decades and how that undergirds this current effort to make one system credible when there are so many other hollow efforts of the past that continue to have ghosts at the table, shall we say. Let's go to Mike, who's going to talk a little bit about U.S. successes and failures, give us some ideas for success, and perhaps inject the conversation with a little bit of hope. No pressure, Mike.
Yeah, so my natural inclination is to be hopeful, but it'll be, I think, difficult in the context of this convo. So again, I was asked to say a few quick things on U.S. policy towards Ethiopia, obviously from the perspective of an outside observer, and I thought what I might do is just revisit where sort of U.S. policy towards the conflict in Tigray, the war in northern Ethiopia, has been, because I think there's been evolution that's brought us to this current point. It's worth sort of appreciating the broad policy arc. And my comments are really about U.S. policy generally, not U.S. policy towards transitional justice. More specifically, I think Ambassador Van Schaak has sort of covered that topic, and I'd certainly defer. I'm not deep in the weeds on TR issues in Ethiopia. I'd certainly defer some of the key questions to Steve and Ibrahim. So if we go back to the onset of the war in Tigray, November 2020, I think that the early diplomatic line from the Trump administration at that time was essentially more or less to back the federal government's narrative of the conflict as a quote law enforcement mission, unquote. And it largely blamed, I think, the political authorities in Tigray, the TPLF, for the war's onset. It was very clear from their public communications on the issue. sort of used phrases along the lines of there could be no equivalence between the parties, largely resisted, I would say, endorsing calls for a ceasefire. So that was I think the early position of the U.S. government, the Trump administration at the time toward the conflict. And this was a view at the time, as I recall, provoked some early concern in Congress, which positioned itself differently. And even there were some segments of the Trump administration that sort of raised some concerns around the policy orientation. The Biden administration, I think very early actually in the presidential transition, so before it formally takes office, so the winter of 2020, 2021, begins to prepare itself to change policy in some pretty important ways. It did not see the war heading towards a quick conclusion, worried about the humanitarian costs, which I would say by December were quite apparent, December 2020, and really also worried about sort of the regional metastasization of the crisis, like regional destabilization and spillover into the broader neighborhood. And so the basis of their policy approach, as carried forward primarily by the new special envoy for the Horn, was to basically back away from support for the federal government and push really for three specific things: a ceasefire and political solution to the conflict, unfettered humanitarian access to Tigray and then other conflict-affected areas in Amhara and Afar, and then a sort of a push for an end to violence against civilians. And as I think you all know, this puts Washington and Addis on a collision course, diplomatic collision course, and then leads to very real public discord and sort of a downgrading of bilateral ties in specific ways, right? A development aid pause, end security cooperation, even as the U.S. surges humanitarian assistance into Ethiopia at that juncture. You know, the dropping of Ethiopia from AGOA, all the rest of it. Interestingly, during this period, the U.S. does gesture at the implementation of sort of more punitive measures or targeted sanctions on the various parties to the conflict, but actually never takes that step beyond imposing targeted sanctions against actors in Eritrea, which I think is notable. And I think this reflected a general desire by the administration to avoid using sanctions as in its Africa policy more generally. So this was a policy preference that was not specific to Ethiopia, it was more general. And also this feeling that it would make the US, this was the argument used at the time, a less effective interlocutor in negotiating a political solution to the crisis. So, you know, once we get to Pretoria, which is in many ways the realization of a key US policy goal in Ethiopia, I think, you know, the US policy has since that time become much more complicated and difficult to read, at least from my perspective. And I think this is in part because it's opened up a debate within the administration about how to proceed. So on the one hand, you have those who argue within the administration that the best way to consolidate Pretoria, to sort of help stabilize Ethiopia more broadly, is to quickly, in fairly short order, rehabilitate bilateral relations and sort of push various areas of tension in the relationship to the backseat. And I think there are as you might imagine, some geostrategic calculations here as well. Sort of the idea of broader US goals vis-a-vis Russia, China, sort of rules-based international order are not really served by alienating Addis, which remains a big player in the Horn of Africa. And perhaps Ethiopia's recent entrance to the BRICS is a topic of conversation in that context. On the other side of the conversation, the policy debate, I think you have those that see the trend lines in Ethiopia as quite grim and urge a more direct, hardline confrontational approach, maybe whatever you want to call it. And so what you get is a policy, I think, that sits in the middle of these two perspectives. That would be my reading, where the US makes concessions on something like ICHREE and the broader question of accountability. I think the US could have done more to preserve that mechanism at the UN Human Rights Council without a question, you know, the lack of support from other partners notwithstanding. At the same time, you know, the U.S. has not moved forward on AGOA. Security cooperation remains quite cautious, I think, about development cooperation more broadly. Humanitarian assistance, I think, generally is trying to avoid the perception that it's returning to a posture of being too close to the federal government in Addis. More generally, I would say at the current moment, my sense, this is my personal view, the relationship between Addis and Washington remains in a very difficult place. This is what I'm picking up on both sides of the relationship. On the US side, I think there's considerable frustration over the aid diversion issue specifically, and specifically the lack of agreement about how to restart food aid. And a lot of this has to do with differences over sort of the targeting of beneficiaries, I think the U.S. also feels like it's not really able to break through diplomatically, encouraging the federal government to pursue genuine political tracks on the conflicts in Amhara and Oromia. I think that's a point of frustration. On the federal government side, my read is, their feeling is sort of, look, we've committed to Pretoria under the assumption this would improve relations with our international partners, but contrary to expectations, the U.S. has not been sufficiently supportive, is making more demands. That's sort of their perspective, their narrative, and I won't adjudicate between either of those. But that's I think that's in part why tensions I think remain in the partnership. And then I'll just say something very quickly on the path forward. I think, look, there are very real limits to the ability of U.S. policymakers to shape dynamics in Ethiopia. We've seen this historically. It's certainly been true over the course of the conflict in the north. But the U.S. has had and does have very considerable leverage. I think U.S. pressure was one of the reasons we got to Pretoria in the first place. I think absent that, it would have been difficult to get to that point. But I think one challenge is certainly over the medium term is a sort of difficulty of sustaining high-level attention on Ethiopia in the U.S. government, given Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, Sudan, and I would say the attention on Ethiopia within the USG has generally been waning at senior levels since 2022. Now, the caveat to this, of course, is that you do have new folks in key positions in country that are taking a fresh look at things. There's a new U.S. ambassador, new USAID mission director. But I think my worry is that the entire region, not just Ethiopia, but the entire region is really on the precipice, and it can't really be resolved, I think, from a U.S. policy perspective, without really getting some high-level diplomatic attention on the region, Ethiopia. So I'm out of time. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Mike. I think you made pretty clear with that last comment why it's so essential that Ethiopia's path forward stay high on the priority list for the U.S. government amidst so many other conflicts and crises around the globe. I want to ask one or two questions with the moderator's prerogative, and then I think I'll alternate between in-room and virtual questions to make sure we get both. Steve, I wanted to ask you, I was originally going to ask you about the other avenues for accountability or the potential avenues, given that ICHREE's mandate has been ended and the commission will be shut down, and sort of the important attention you've placed on continuing to document and the role of that work in prevention. But I actually think it's important to note, as you said, that if this is the only game in town, how do we infuse meaningful justice and accountability into the process? What steps can we take to ensure there is credibility, given the history, given the fact that there is still fighting, there are still abuses and atrocities underway, and that a number of folks in this room have eagerly nodded their head at the point that we are not in a period of transition? What steps do you think practically could be taken, and who are the key players?
Thanks. Well, I speak, in my own personal capacity here, and not on behalf of the commission. So I would say that it's important. I would emphasize the point that Ibrahim made about not just sort of playing along with the process as it is through technical assistance. Aiding a flawed process is effectively abetting a flawed process. And so we recommend very clearly that assistance to Ethiopia with the ongoing process be, in a sense, conditioned. That may come across, in the global South as sort of neo-imperial idea, but effectively that there has to be meeting of international standards during this process in order for there to be involvement of outside actors, in order for there to be foreign funding. Now, I realize that there can be some roles for civil society. ICTJ is doing empowerment of non-state groups to engage in the process, and that's helpful. But in terms of actually assisting the government with this process, it's got to be according to the existing standards that we talk about in our advisory note and in our report, or it just shouldn't be given at all. And so, I wouldn't say it's impossible to fix this process. It just requires a complete change of mind and heart in order to turn it around. And there are clear ways they can demonstrate that now by doing the easy things. The easy things are not putting Abiy on trial, right? Or putting his generals on trial. Those are the hard things. The easy things are removing people from office, showing some kind of remorse for atrocities, getting Eritrean forces out of the north, beginning some kind of serious reparations and psychosocial support for victims in the north. These are the things that are, the politically, normally one would think of as politically less challenging than the full criminal accountability, which everybody recognizes takes longer. So I would say that process, that idea of getting the existing process to conform with international standards is essential. And for me, one of the ways that has to be done is to slow it down and to broaden it. They're working with this sort of set of arbitrary deadlines, again, as part of this quasi-compliance strategy. I know that the U.S. government is, realizes what's going on, and but I do think that if it's a question that the good faith really has to be demonstrated, because it hasn't been demonstrated yet. And I think that for individual states to use these benchmarks in an affirmative way is very important. I hope that also other UN mechanisms do the same. I think there's a role for the High Commissioner in using his independent authority to remind Ethiopia. I think there's a role for the special mechanisms of the UN. I think there's roles for the special UN Undersecretaries General. But fundamentally, I think this boils down to the member states because they have the most influence.
Thanks. I think this is a real opportunity for some cooperation across regional and international levels, and a mixing or a melding of, as we've heard the various officials, senior officials in the administration talk a lot about interests and values. And I happen to be a strong believer that they don't necessarily have to be separated out, but not everyone is a fan of that view. I don't want us to run short on time, so let's go to the audience for some questions. Let's do the audience here in the room, and then I'll turn to the virtual folks. So if you have a question, could you please put your hand up? There will be a mic coming. I would ask that you introduce yourself, where you come from, and please keep your question brief and make sure it's a question. Lauren.
Hello, Lauren Blanchard with the Congressional Research Service. Thank you to all of the panelists for your very thoughtful remarks. I wanted to follow up a bit on, we are a year out from the COHA, and with ICHREE closing down, curious about your thoughts on any signs of progress in terms of the government allowing independent investigation of human rights abuses in the conflict areas, and particularly in Tigray. We know, for example, that humanitarians now have access to most of Tigray. There are flights in and out. We've been told that human rights researchers can go to Tigray, but I noted the other day that the head of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission stated that they could not, in their annual IDP report, address the issue of what's happening to IDPs in Tigray because it was inaccessible. And a year after the COHA, it's quite notable to hear the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission say that it doesn't have access in Tigray. So I'm curious if you see any progress there in the context of quasi-compliance, also sort of more broadly. What more should we be expecting if the government were trying to move forward with transitional justice in terms of investigations in the conflict areas?
Thanks, Lauren. Great question. Who wants to take that?
I can start, but I'd like to hear also from Ambassador Van Schaak. I mean, I think the thing to distinguish is the difference between monitoring and investigation. So the government is allowing OHCHR and monitors to go to parts of the country that were previously closed off. And those monitors sort of follow what's going on. They write reports to OHCHR in Addis. They forward those reports to Geneva. But that's very different from actual investigation, where you meet with people and interview them according to protocols, write up reports. That was the work that was done by us remotely. That was the work that was done in a flawed way by the JIT. That was the work that was supposed to be done by the African Commission, special body on Ethiopia that the Ethiopians managed to close down. That is not happening. That is not happening because the government doesn't want it to happen. And it doesn't want independent investigations. It wants to have control of that process. So it's willing to tolerate monitoring, where you just sort of observe violations, but you don't actually figure out who was responsible, who might have been ordering that, participating in the atrocities. And that's the distinction that's going on in my view. But I'd be curious to hear if perhaps there's a more additional information that the U.S. has learned about this issue. If Ambassador would like to comment on that.
Thanks, Steve. Does anyone else want to come in from the panel? Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to read out a question. Thanks. I appreciate the difference between investigation and monitoring, and I think robust monitoring can sometimes also include investigation, but obviously that is up to particular actors who are undertaking that. The first question from the virtual world. What are the implications or significances of the success of the Pretoria peace deal to conflicts in other parts of the country, which we've touched on a little bit today? Who would like to take that one? If no one's going to take it.
I mean, I can offer just again from our perspective.
Thanks, Steve.
The COHA is limited to the north. We certainly hoped that it might be a model, for some sort of stability overrides, but it's a minimalist agreement. It doesn't really deal with underlying causes, and so the fact that we have this violence in 2 or 3 other states, despite COHA, I think means that it doesn't really offer much. Now, perhaps the African Union will decide to create, to involve itself in these other regions. I haven't seen any evidence of that so far, but I think COHA is a minimalist agreement that has accomplished a significant diminution in violence in the north. But I haven't personally, and nor have our investigators, seen any positive effects of that agreement on the other regions.
Can I jump in here and just add to what Steve said, that Pretoria is it may be an imperfect arrangement, but it's hard to also criticize it too much, because it actually buys time and creates an opportunity for something deeper to take place. So you can't really say don't take it as a model, because as a model it could serve in basically bringing down the physical violence that is taking place and create opportunities for deeper negotiations. But it's also, you can't really hold it out as a model, because you really have no guarantees that a Tigray conflict isn't going to restart tomorrow, or immediately after Pretoria, what happened was the alliance on one side broke down and started infighting, and you have another war taking place in a second region in Ethiopia, and maybe a conflict will start with Eritrea. So it's really, you can't really hold it out as a model, but you can't really criticize it either, because it does create this opportunity for further and deeper negotiations, political negotiations.
Yeah, and maybe if I could also just jump in, and I think Ibrahim has framed framed it correctly. I mean, on the one hand, we have to keep in mind sort of when in the conflict the Pretoria Arrangement was reached, and what was likely to happen if an agreement wasn't found at that point. I mean, the war was in a very volatile place, and the levels of human suffering we were likely about to see in Tigray might have even surpassed what we'd seen up until that point. So it was an important achievement in that regard. Of course, part of the challenge of Pretoria is that this was a conflict between multiple players, but it's only an agreement between two of them, right? The Tigrayan, the TPLF, and the federal government, and of course, there are political forces in the Amhara region that feel somewhat aggrieved about the agreement, right? And not just the agreement, but also its implementation, right? And say that, Tigrayan forces have not been demobilized, and this has implications for, the ability of Amhara political forces to retain their armed force. Eritrea seems, is I think behind the scenes not happy with the agreement, although they're not formally saying they're opposed to it, right? But they have some concerns around implementation. So those are very real, I think, that issues. And so ultimately, it's not, I think Pretoria is good, but it has to be broadened at some point.
I think the question of implementation is also what might make it a viable agreement for other conflicts underway or crises. If you don't see either or both parties beginning to implement, which all of you have alluded to, in a meaningful, credible way, it's only as good as the paper it's written on. And then, of course, there are the parties that are playing roles that had nothing to do with the agreement and continue to play roles. Let's go to the room. Are there other questions here? Please raise your hand. One right here. Microphone is coming your way.
My name is Masfin Ayano from the Tigrayan community, part of the Tigray Center for Information and Communications, and also a board member of the Garalta Institute for Policy Research and Training. In passing, without making any judgments, let me express my concerns on Ambassador's presentation that essentially gives a lot of credit, so to speak, for the government of Ethiopia taking the initiatives in terms of the transitional justice process. So far, if anyone has not really gotten wind of the character and behavior of the government in the past 3 years, then I think either naive or a serious misconception of it. Because the Ethiopian government responds to international community when it feels there is a pressure, then it gives this impression that it's committed to whatever it demands at this moment, this time the transitional justice. So there is no precedence for the Ethiopian government having been really seriously interested in resolving the problem. Having said that, two things. One, the transitional justice system that we are actually talking about, in the absence of the implementation of COHA itself, will be a meaningful exercise because a big part of it has not been implemented. Secondly, I think from a theoretical point of view, to even talk about transitional justice in the absence of transition, or in the absence of peace for that matter, even in Ethiopia, even particularly in Tigray, where violence still continues in many parts, and ICHREE has alluded to that. And without that, I think it's a meaningless exercise. And I think Abadir is correct in saying, I think unless we want to be, sit on the chair, on the table, then I think we should essentially reject it and really start a serious dialogue in terms of how this should be framed again. And I think I'm really as a community, we have serious concerns about this, but really at this level, we should be willing to really talk about how do we reframe this process again. I think that's Thank you very much.
Panelists, I want to ask you to hold your comments on this question of reframing while I take one from the virtual audience as well. This was lightly touched on, but I think it's important to front it a little bit, which is a question on Eritrea and the Eritrean military forces, which is how is transitional justice expected to deal with crimes committed by the Eritrean military? Does the Ethiopian judiciary have jurisdiction to entertain such cases? What are the options here, if any? If you could take both of those questions at once, and then we will be able to wrap. Thank you.
So this was an issue that we did consider in our report. It is possible under Ethiopian law for the government to prosecute any offenses that take place on its territory, including those by foreign forces. At the same time, the government has made clear, even when they met us last July, when we were sort of they were in a more cooperationist approach to ICHREE, they basically indicated that they would only be going after Eritrean forces through a sort of mutual legal assistance program, where the two governments would work together. It's hard to really imagine how that would really work, whether that Eritrea would allow Ethiopia to prosecute Eritrean soldiers. And it's equally difficult to imagine the government right now trying to do that, given that Eritrea might well be the more powerful of the two countries. And so I think that's one of our unfortunately, one of our gloomiest assessments is that there is no realistic path forward right now for any kind of accountability of the Eritrean forces for their atrocities since the beginning in this war, atrocities that are ongoing. And I think that's an enormous challenge. At the same time, again, looking forward in terms of prevention, the most important first step is for the government to live up to its commitment in Koha regarding the territorial integrity, which was understood at the time to mean an obligation to ask Eritrean forces to leave. And that has not been implemented. So before we even talk about accountability, the first step is for Ethiopia to live up to the Koha and ensure the removal of the Eritrean forces.
Can I quickly, Sarah, jump in here and say, from an Ethiopian legal point of view as well, the answer is a very quick, yes, Ethiopia does have jurisdiction, but I also want to take this opportunity to warn that these technical questions don't really matter in this specific setting. We have to remember that we're dealing with the potentiality of state collapse in Ethiopia. So there is no scenario in which Ethiopia is going to investigate Eritrean soldiers, atrocities, and so on. Let's just keep, let's be realistic. Let's talk about state collapse. Let's talk about preventing state collapse and a transition to a stable form of government in Ethiopia. But if we raise it as a technical question, it's an easy yes. Ethiopia does have jurisdiction.
And it's also, I think, worth noting, I mean, this is fundamentally a political question, and the trend line on Eritrea-Ethiopia relations at the moment are not good. So the likelihood of cooperation between the two governments on TJ issues at this moment are very low. I mean, they've been low for the past 2 years, but they're particularly low right now.
I'll second the statement. This is a political issue, and Mikhail's statement really sums it up.
Thanks, everyone. I think this question of Eritrea is so important, and I think there's also a role for outside actors to play in trying to figure out where and how Eritrea continues to get and obtain its resources, what its networks are, and how it is able to maintain the strength that it's had. I would hazard a guess that there are a number of people in this room and on the online that might say it's not just the last 2 years that the relations between Eritrea and Ethiopia have been troubled, that it's a long history that actually requires outside actors to play a more engaged and constructive role. I know there's a lot of other questions, including the role of the United States in helping to implement the COA, including questions about victims groups and whether or not they support transitional justice. I'm terribly sorry that we haven't been able to get to all of those. They're very important questions. I hope we will figure out across Refugees International, OSF, and Amnesty International, ways to ensure that our panelists do answer those questions. So I want to make sure that we're able to do that after we close today. But mostly I want to thank Ambassador Van Schaik. Thank you for staying. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate your remarks. I suspect there may be some follow-up that keeps you a little busy for a while. And to our panelists, thank you for joining, for offering your analysis and information, taking the questions. I'm terribly sorry not to be in the room with you and want to keep looking back at you. But thank you again. We really enjoyed your analysis and are grateful for your time. With that, we'll take a 10-minute coffee break for those in the room, and then we will move to panel 2. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. Bye-bye.
7 minutes short enough to say what I have to say. Yeah, we are about to begin. Thank you so much. Kindly take your seats. Thank you so much for everybody for coming around, and thank you to the panelists. We had a powerhouse panel in the first panel. I don't know if we'll be able to best them, but at the very minimum, we'll try to be as good as theirs. With me, I have incredible roster of individuals who have been working on Ethiopia for a very long time, some from Ethiopia, some from elsewhere, that will build up on the, really good sets of conversations that were had in the first panel. We'll kick off with Michelle, Gavin, who will be giving the opening remark to the panel, and then we will move to Faisal, and Adem and Chidi to give really a broad swath of overview, starting with, the conflict in Ethiopia post-Koha is not just now a question of Tigray. It is also in the Oromia region, it's in Amhara region and other regions, but also it doesn't just involve Ethiopia, it involves the region and countries that are not necessarily in the region. Without further ado, I'll hand the floor to Michelle to give her opening remarks. Over to you, Michelle.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me. I can't wait to listen to the other panelists and learn from them. There's so much expertise here. And I want to sort of be honest about who I am. I don't pretend to be an Ethiopia expert. My own expertise really is around how the US tends to make policy in the region. And I was asked to just open us up with some reflections on the current reality in Ethiopia and the expectations that we all had following Ahmed Abiy's ascent to power. And this is I think, a healthy exercise for me, and I'm going to do some work to hold myself accountable for some of the things that I thought and hoped for, and the wishful thinking that I fell victim to as well. I certainly think that for the US and for many of Ethiopia's partners, there was tremendous enthusiasm, right, for where Ethiopia could be taking us under new leadership, a sense that there's sort of inherent tensions in a policy of support for a security partner, a development partner that was repressive and authoritarian internally, that we could transcend those tensions. And to be fair, Abiy at his in his inaugural address spoke to the mistakes of the past, emphasized the importance of justice, of democracy, talked about how the law must rule us all equally, will make necessary reforms so democracy can flourish, so freedom and justice will reign, right? So we loved the messages and the action. There were the release of political prisoners in the first months of Abiy Ahmed's tenure, the decriminalization of some of the armed opposition groups, work to heal schisms within the church, traveling to every region of this country, this message of inclusivity. All of this was sort of music to our ears, I think. And I myself, in 2018, I went back and looked at some of the things I wrote about Ethiopia, trying to urge US policymakers to seize this opportunity. I talked about where I fell into the trap of personalization, talked about what a compelling figure he was, a breath of fresh air. And I think that even those of us who were aware we had overly personalized our relationship with Ethiopia during the Meles era tended to do the same thing with Abiy Ahmed, in part because it was easier than really wrestling with all of the complexities and tensions within Ethiopia. So then, as you know, even before the war in Tigray broke out, as various data points failed to align with this narrative of democratic reform, I think there was a tendency to sort of dismiss those data points as the kind of growing pains of a difficult reform agenda. And so I'm going to hold myself accountable again. January 2020, I wrote, Abiy Ahmed's ambitious reform plans will be tested in the year ahead. Since taking the helm of government, he's been a whirlwind of activity, opening up political space and economic possibilities. But Ethiopia's complexity and the way the lessons of its history have been framed present real challenges to this audacious overhaul and his stated goals of bringing more unity to the state and more justice to its people. So I think, you know, it was, of course, the war that made it impossible to continue to believe we had a shared understanding of commitment to human rights, and certainly shattered the sort of mythologizing of this person. You know, I think at this point, he's understood in many ways as an unreliable partner. He's understood as having sort of a messianic quality or self-perception. And he looks weak. He looks like a weak leader, sort of spinning plates, trying to build a new coalition of support. But more importantly, what we see is the continuing erosion of basic human rights, political and civil rights. We continue to see journalists arrested. We continue to see waves of detentions, house-to-house searches in numerous parts of the country where it's not really clear that there's much in the way of due process going on. But what's interesting, I think, is how quickly the US and other members of the international community seem to have abandoned an emphasis on accountability for crimes that have occurred in Ethiopia, and to some degree acquiesced to this notion that these issues of accountability for rights abuses are off the table in bilateral discussions and multilateral discussions. And it's very reminiscent of the way issues of political space were off the table in our relationship with Ethiopia previously. So we seem forever to be falling back into old patterns. So the era of enthusiasm is gone, and yet it does not seem to have been replaced by strategic clarity from those outside Ethiopia, certainly from the United States, about how to manage this relationship and the degree to which our interests and values are and are not aligned. So with this just sort of broad frame, I turn it over to the rest of the panel.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I think you were speaking for many when you said that, you know, Abiy mania is real. There are many who are taken in. And I think also it is very pointed that you mentioned the lack of strategic clarity, even in the face of all that is available over the last couple of years with respect to Abiy's position. I think there is a sense that, you know, the sense of the mania has given into excuses. And that really, the default really here is, oh, Ethiopia is a strategic country. We can make a case for every country at least being strategic. I want to make one administrative issue here. There will be a pen and a pencil that will be going, a pencil and a paper that will be going around for people within the room. If they have got questions, please feel free to write. Faisal, I want to start with you. You said 7 minutes is not too long to speak about what you are going to speak about, but it's not too short also to speak about what you want to speak about. So I really want you to talk about, the issue in the South. In the first panel, the discussions was rightfully around the Tigrayan question, but since Koha, we've seen tension elsewhere. And these tensions are not new; they are old tension, but they are coming up. Would you want to speak about in the Oromia region and in the South, what is transpiring and the respective causes and concern in the South? Over to you, Faisal.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take a minute to also thank the organizers of this conference. Actually, I became what they call in Amharic a Buddha or misfortune teller in the Ethiopian politics. Simply because in 1993, I wrote an article for the Ethiopian Review and raised the issue of the Red Sea and the fact that Ethiopia was losing its only outlet at that time. It will come to a hand. Not that I was taking a position, but I was being an analyst and could see what could happen in the future. In 2018, I gave an interview to the BBC radio and literally said Abiy was more of a priest than a policymaker. And a lot of people, especially Somalis and Oromos, just raided on me, saying that I was biased. And then in 1929, I wrote an article where I said Ethiopian state is a failed state, not yet collapsed, but failed, and looked at several indices as to what makes it fail. So I feel bad in a sense I'm coming always as a misfortune teller. But let me just say that when I talk about the South and the Oromo region, which was not mentioned as much this morning, has both geographic as well as the political construction. Geographic in the sense that Oromia and the South are south of the center of power from Addis Ababa. So you have the South, the East, Somalis, Oromo, Afar, Sidama, what have you. The political construct is also that these people were annexed to the Ethiopian empire, starting after the Adwa War. But as late as 1954, when the last patch of the Somaliland was annexed to Ethiopia, 1954, my dad had a marriage certificate with my mom. It's as late as that. So the issues that we are looking at is bigger than transitional justice. It's really embedded in the Ethiopian state formation, which brings a lot of issues. As to the Oromo, when you talk about, and I like to talk about the Oromo simply because I'm at best when I'm looking from outside in, so that I'm not biased. Imagine the Oromo region alone is as big as Sudan in terms of population. So we know how the US gives a lot of attention to the Sudan crisis and don't mention even the Oromo question. It's geographically as large as Kenya. Kenya is the epicenter of American politics when it comes to democratization and what have you. And if you add the Somali, the Afar, the Sidama, what have you, you're really talking about a major country, which doesn't come into the radar of policymakers. So with that, while Somalis are really recovering from the 2007-2014 massive human rights abuse, which was not that far, away. And that's why Steve's report and the ICHREE report syncs with me in the sense that it ends that report by saying that the future holds some serious human rights abuse for Ethiopia, simply because the issue of abuse comes back, it's not addressed, and it piles up. So for Somalis, they have the 2007-2018 blockade, massive rape with our women. Now we are dealing with the Tigray, which we just talked about this morning, and then the Oromo situation, which really started, the war in Oromia started in 2018, right after Abiy took power and the so-called Garo or youth rebellion. Now, I think the situation is getting deteriorated, particularly in the Walega area where the Ola center is. Villages are being burned left and right with impunity. Youth have been arrested in the thousands. I mean, Ethiopia ran out of jails with these arrests, and they are building new camps. Now, why is this happening in Oromia at this particular time? And why the situation is deteriorating? I would just cite three factors that contribute to this. Number one, I think this morning we talked a lot. The people of Ethiopia, particularly in Oromia and the Somali region and the South in general, don't see any transition. There is no prospect for transition to nowhere. We are settled with a long-term autocratic system. And you look back at the Ethiopian history from the imperial, which was a personal rule, Mengistu's dictator, by the way, 50 years since Mengistu power, next, few months, to the EPRDF, which Samuel Huntington really propped up to make it again a classical autocratic rule to the current situation, which is again a form of autocratic rule. There is no prospect in the future for people to really see any positivity. The second is when Abiy came to power, several groups, including the Ogaden National Liberation Front, the Oromo Liberation Front, agreed to put down their guns and went to sign a peace treaty. Those peace treaties have been completely undermined by the government of Ethiopia. So with Ola already in the jungle fighting, with the Somali Ogaden National Liberation Front lately writing in public, in Twitter, in its press releases, that they have run out of patience and they may not rule out restarting their struggle. And if you guys know, the Ogaden National Liberation Front is probably the longest armed struggle in the entire world as far as we know. They started in 1963, had a cut off here and there, restarted in the 70s with the big Ogaden War, and then the last 30 years they were. So if the East starts to burn down again, then really the collapse of the state may be hastened. And then the third factor for the Oromo is there is a serious inter-Oromo elite conflict, which is really feeding Abiy's, narrative in a way. That's also contributing to escalation of. Now, when I look at the reality on the ground, I really get scared. Number one, you have heard the Ethiopian minister giving his report card recently about the high school leaving certificate exam. 3% passed. 3% of the Ethiopian youth who took the exam could ever dream to go to college. In the Somali region, it was 0.3%. In Afar, I think it was 0.2. 1 million students sat for the exam. The rest who didn't get a chance to even get to high school, roaming around, they are a potential recruit for any type of army struggle, particularly in the Somali and Eastern Oromia region for Al-Shabaab. And that's a very frightening reality on the ground. Joblessness is also rampant. Fear of death of the youth and being rounded up by the army to conscript them, particularly in Oromia region, is really very high. And that needs to be taken into account. And with women and young girls, the weaponization of sex became a norm in Ethiopia. I think this started with the later days of the Derg, continued in the EPRDF time in the Somali region, where at one time AIDS was unknown, but when they started 2007, 2014 to blockade the Somali region, the incidence of AIDS with women just rapidly increased. Now, I think where does the US and those of us who are here fit in this scheme? We talked very much about traditional justice and sometimes in a way that most people probably was shocked to hear that the only option we have is with the government of Ethiopia to carry the transitional justice, which is really scary to many people. Those of us who know about Ethiopian politics, that may be not really the attractive option. I will just touch three areas where I think we need to really enhance and collaborate. One is what is the US's strategic interest in Ethiopia? How is that defined? Is that militaristic? I lived through the war on terror, which devastated Somalis and some parts of Eastern Oromia. What is the US's priority in the region from a strategic point of view? Is it to help democratize the region? Is it to bring, additional justice in a very effective way? What is it? I mean, the old style of propping up Mobutu-type dictators will not work for American interests as well as for Ethiopia. So that's one. The second is the role of the diaspora, Ethiopian Americans, who up to this point contributed largely to the process negatively. We remember the No More movement when Tigray was blockaded and people were dying. Those of us were shouting to just drop food for the people so that they don't die. But the very diaspora that is supposed to help, we're just running around and supporting the blockade and the massive raid. So the diaspora's role. And then human rights advocacy group is like this group. How can we really align these three forces so that they can play a positive role in contributing positively the transition that we have not seen yet? There's no transition we can talk about. But if we can bring U.S. strategic interest and define from more humanistic point of view, and I'm of the view that the last time the U.S. had an upper hand at UN and international forums were during Carter, when human rights issues at the center of U.S. politics, at the center. The other one was the cultural aspect of America that also played a significant role in bringing the youth to what is America. Both of them are not being enforced by the U.S. government. So can we really redefine the U.S. policy towards Africa? And with that, can we bring these three forces that I explained in concert with each other so we can address? And I think with that, probably I run out of time.
I'll give you a minute if there's something burning, but there's also Q&A where you can come back.
So if the East Fall if the Oromia issue is not arrested, consider what could happen to Somalia, to Djibouti, and to Kenya. The reason why we want the conflict to be arrested as soon as possible and attention being given to Oromia and to the Somali region is that the entire region could literally be lost. By the way, there is one secret that most Ethiopians we know, but the other outsiders probably know, but no less. The question is asked up north in Ethiopia is different than the question is asked in South and East. South and East have always struggled for self-determination, including and up to seceding from the rest of Ethiopia. So if the Oromo issue continues unarrested, you can really see Ethiopia falling apart and disintegrating the same way that we have seen in other countries. If we can arrest the question in the South, then we can probably move towards other ways to address the issue. And thank you.
Faisal, you're not very hopeful. Some of the issues that you're raising, they are very important, and really you also touched and you also provide the historical context within which some of these things are happening. I didn't realize the Oromia region is as large as Kenya as a Kenyan, but thank you for reminding me that. I think we have Adam on the line. Adam, is it possible for you, just similar to what Faisal has provided, in the Oromia region, what is going on and what are the respective causes, as well as the concern, especially after the signing of cessation of hostilities? Over to you, Adam.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure a bit depressing to listen to the first panel. Also very difficult to hear Michelle and Faisal. I'll be talking about the second region. Faisal talked about Oromia, how big it is, how significant it is geographically in terms of its size and all. Amhara is not as large, but it's the second largest, and also quite significant. So just quickly, I think in terms of what is happening, maybe just I'm sure a lot of people have the idea. But the Amhara region, particularly since August, across the region, has been in a conflict. Armed groups have been engaging the federal army. And if you read the recent report of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, it's virtually everywhere across the region. And I think that makes it even bigger than what is happening in Oromia. You know, in Oromia, it's certain parts where it's intense, but in Amhara, you know, it started late, but it's across the region. In terms of, I think the violence that has been happening there, the use of heavy weaponry and drones, it's essentially the region has been under difficult situations. Schools have not started in a lot of places and all. So I would invite people to read the recent report of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. I'll just add that I think that the tendency is to put it as a kind of a Fano rebellion. But my reading and my sense of it is actually a sort of a popular rejection of the government. And essentially a sense of lack of representation among the Amharas, and the Fano, the armed wing, essentially is an extension of that, rather than a reflection or representation of what is happening. And in fact, I think still difficult. People may reject the government, but they are still not sure in terms of what they want. Including the armed rebellion and all. In terms of the causes, I think part of it is obviously connected to what is happening across the country. Some of us have touched on it. Ethiopia, unfortunately, has a very authoritarian, very exclusive political history. And unfortunately, on top of that, there's also a tendency for a hegemonic group to emerge. And because of the sensitivities around identity and all, whenever there's a hegemony, it's attributed to a certain group. And so it's in the nature of the Ethiopian politics that it generates resistance. But when it comes to the Amhara in particular, I think that the main concern in the region is about narrative. The tendency among Ethiopia in particular, particularly what Faisal calls the South in Oromia and Somalia, is to relate the previous governments with the people of Amhara. And so all the oppression that those governments did, all the violence they caused across the country, despite some nuances, it is often attributed to the Amhara. So there's this narrative of Amharas oppressing. But in reality, Amharas, even though the leadership spoke their language, they were themselves oppressed, right? Especially Amharas that were in their own regions, which is most of the Amharas. And so there is that disconnect between a narrative of oppression and a reality of suppression, right? And then, of course, particularly in the early 90s, when the Derg was defeated, there was a lot of attacks on Amhara, especially whenever there is tension within the Oromos, whenever there is tension between the OLF and other groups, often the violence occurs, violence targets other groups. And it happened in the early 1990s, and also particularly after Abiy Ahmed came to power. And so you have the sense of displacement, the sense of suppression. And so you have a narrative of oppression and an experience essentially of displacement, of victimhood and all. And also a reality of deprivation. I think according to socioeconomic indicators, Amhara in a lot of things is behind the national average. But when you look at the numbers and all, and so you have these essentially contrast, and particularly since Abiy Ahmed came, and just before him, so there was a sense that the Amharas were not represented by their political party. So the Amhara National Democratic Movement was actually called the Ethiopian National Democratic Movement when it became essentially changed itself from an Ethiopian party to an Amhara party under the convincing, perhaps a little pressure from the TPLF in the early 1990s. And so this party had this pan-Ethiopian vision, but it was administering what is supposed to be an Amhara region. So there was this disconnect that the party did not represent the Amharas. And I think what changed, in my opinion, in the last 8 years, from 2016, was the opening, the creation of possibilities for that growing sense of Amhara nationalism to manifest itself. And so with the formation of the what is called the National Association, NAMA, the main opposition party in Amhara, in 2000, it was established in 2018. And in 2019, it kind of particularly penetrated even the Amhara region itself, with the rise of the late Asamoah Tigray, which was seen as a hero. And so you have the frustration essentially, and then the last 8 years kind of gave, they provided some enabling factors that led to the situation. And the war in 2020 was an excellent opportunity for Amhara nationalism essentially to rise to the fore. And so it provided experience, it provided a rallying point, particularly in relation to the contestations around the land Walqite, Western Tigray. And it kind of gave the armed groups experience and opportunity to assert themselves. And so you have, the factors, the systematic reasons, and then what emerged, what the war enabled was for the idea of Amhara nationalism to be strengthened, but also for the actors to get strength and experience in fighting and all. And so, in my opinion, it was only a matter of time. So a lot of people think the Amhara armed groups were allied with the federal government, but they were really protecting what they considered was theirs. So it was really a marriage of convenience. And so it was always, for me, the mother of all conflicts was waiting to happen. And unfortunately, with the sense of lack of representation, and in particular, I think the inability of the Amhara branch of the ruling party to transform itself. It's very lethargic. It moves very, very slowly. Its leadership has stayed up for very long, and therefore it was unable to understand, articulate, and respond to the demands of the people in Amhara. And that is what I think, what ultimately led to the rebellion. In terms of the concerns, and I'll be very quick here, obviously the human rights, the humanitarian situation is very difficult to speak about in terms of schooling, in terms of health situation, in terms of livelihoods. It has been very disruptive, but at a systemic level, it extremely puts into test, it undermines essentially the possibility of implementation of the Pretoria and Nairobi agreements. I think whether we talk about transitional justice or the issue of contested lands, there is really no government now to talk with the Tigrayans to find a political solution. And also the national dialogue itself. So it kind of messes up all the structural responses that the country needs. And of course, I think, unfortunately, the target at the moment, at least at the federal level, seems to be to suppress it militarily. And from the Amhara armed groups perspective as well, there hasn't emerged, at least not yet, a coherent force that is able to articulate what it wants, and also to negotiate. And so my fear is that I think this is gonna continue as it is, and with it, I think the ability of the transitional justice and national dialogue process, I think even for those who had hope at the start of some of these things, have become extremely complicated, if not impossible, as it happens now. And so we're going to need, I think, a revamping of the whole process, considering what is happening in Oromia and in Amhara, because I think without resolving those, it will be impossible to address what is happening in Tigray. And in fact, I fear that considering the size of the regions and their geography and all, it might be more complicated and more difficult. Thank you. And perhaps if I have half a minute, I think Michelle talked about feeling bad about the hope that she had and all, but I don't think we should feel bad about it. I think it was good that we gave a chance. We get the benefit of the doubt to a new administration. I think it is only human to do that, rather than automatically, reflectively rejecting something new. It's only good that we were willing to give the benefit of the doubt to a new regime. And I think that's what gives us the legitimacy to be critical of it now, because we didn't reject it automatically. We gave it a chance. We gave it the benefit of the doubt, and it didn't deliver. And so that I think we shouldn't feel bad. It gives us the legitimacy to be critical of it when it is needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adem. I want to switch gears now and give Chidi a chance to zoom away from the internal dynamics and now take a broader regional and international response to the situation in Ethiopia, and probably provide some next steps, recommendations on how some of the issues that have been raised could be resolved. Over to you, Chidi.
Good morning over there. It's dark where I am in many ways. I have to apologize. I'm in a West African village on borrowed time and borrowed battery power. I actually have about 20 minutes of battery power left.
Chidi, we will understand if for one reason or the other you go off, we'll completely take whatever we can get from you in the time that you have.
Thank you very much, Abdullahi. Let me join in thanking the organizers as well for this. The international engagement with Ethiopia has kind of waxed and waned over the past 82 years or thereabouts, since the reinstatement of the emperor following Mussolini's pillage of Ethiopia from between 1935 and May 1941. And of course, the effort to reinstate the emperor was a truly international effort in many ways, involving regiments from different parts of the world. And Ethiopia, of course, has the longest continuing diplomacy in Africa. South Africa can want to compete, but South Africa's diplomacy was in effect re-engineered in 1994. And so Ethiopia's experience of international diplomacy is a lot more practiced than most African countries, and quite capable as a result of producing the most cynical of outcomes. And I think that's what we see in the international engagement with Ethiopia. The Abiy regime has had the benefit of engaging with this diplomacy, even when he has tried to dismantle it in some of the, or render it incapable in some of the ways that he did in the aftermath around the onset of the war. But I really want to say that that's really the context for me that frames the international engagement. And maybe by way of trying to get my punchline in early, where do I see the opportunities? I think there are three potential opportunities in relation to international engagement with Ethiopia in the short term. One is the election, the opportunity. There is an opportunity in the election of a new chairperson of the Commission of the African Union in 2024. Mid next year, the African Union has to elect a new chairperson. The current chairperson has been an absolute utter waste of time. At least that's my personal opinion. And it's quite unfortunate because the AU has effectively wasted the office of the chairperson since Mrs. Mbeki, Dr. Ms. Zuma wasted her tenure looking to become the president of the ANC and of South Africa, rather than doing the work for which she was sent to South Africa. And following her, this dude is about to waste 8 years. That's 12 years of absolute waste of the continent's diplomatic asset value. And so whoever is elected in next year is going to have to reconstitute the authority of that office. And in hindsight, Jean Ping was an absolute steal and a total genius. And that probably tells you how bad things have been since Jinping left the office of the chairperson. So that's one opportunity. And I think civil society has got to get involved. Academia have got to get involved. And this is important because the AU obviously does have a hand to deal in the Ethiopian situation. The AU is a guest of Ethiopia, and the African input into the continental input into the management of Ethiopia or the situation in Ethiopia is going to have to be mediated, or in any case, we'll have to confront the reality of dealing with the AU. The second is the Mbeki high-level implementation panel, much as people will have opinions about it, still does exist, actually. Now, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia knew that, does not want Mbeki involved, and that was how he reached the deal with the chairperson of the AU, whose name I don't want to mention here because the surname kind of involves a swear word. So I think what I have learned is that the Prime Minister essentially reached a deal with the chairperson in order to make President Obasanjo his personal envoy, so that he could avoid a mandate of the Peace and Security Council of the AU, which would have had to confront the AU-HIP, which has a regional mandate over the Horn of Africa, chaired by President Mbeki. President Mbeki has resurrected his interest in the region as a whole, and the fragmentation of, there are fragmentation tendencies in Sudan, and you don't want that extending into the rest of the region, but that is a real possibility. The third possibility is to transform the understanding and international understanding of the situation of Ethiopia from the human rights analysis that we've mostly concentrated on into a regional security analysis with a regional fragmentation threat in view, which will engage a set of assets that we've not usually engaged with. And I do think the regional fragmentation argumentation right now in relation to Ethiopia is fairly strong, given what's happening next door in Sudan. And I do think those three can be married up, these three can be married up in one package of rethinking how we engage with the situation in Ethiopia. But essentially, just to backstop this story of possible opportunities is the fact that Ethiopia really hosts the African continent, hosts the United Nations in Africa, is an anchor country in IGAD. Ethiopia is too big for IGAD, period. Just as Nigeria is too big for ECOWAS. And that means, therefore, that you've got to mobilize other internationals or institutions to be able to impact in some form on what is happening in Ethiopia. But looking to IGAD basically means ensuring that nothing works. Even if IGAD will have to be involved in some form, it cannot be a primary convener of international response on Ethiopia. Ethiopia, given that, has suborned essentially in all relevant international institutions, either to make sure it does not come up on the agenda of the United Nations Security Council or any of the major institutions, or Peace and Security Council of the African Union, or to make sure that they are retrenched. With the African Commission investigation, for instance, it essentially did a deal with the Commission, the Commission's chairperson, in order to bury the report in return for the support of Ethiopia for the re-election of the chairperson, which has just happened, all right? And so that essentially is where we are. It seems to me that we've got to rethink how we engage with Ethiopia in order to persuade international actors and continental actors to see new opportunities. And in my view, we do have a major opportunity in pressing flesh and pressing necks ahead of the election of the new chairperson next year. Can I yield here? And if I'm bounced, you know that battery and energy hunger have taken their course. Thank you very much.
Chidi would love you to do everything within your power to stay, because your insights are very valuable, especially on the situation regarding the chair's election and many others. I think we will get into the question and answer session here, and I'll start with you, Faisal. What are the implications of not addressing the crisis in Oromia that you painted in a very dark, way? And are there opportunities of localized means of trying to address some of the issues that you raised?
Yeah, thank you. I think not addressing the Oromia issue could have two consequences. One is obviously, if the war continues, the OLF agenda, which is still part of the program that it has, which is complete cessation from Ethiopia, could be revived, especially in the view that the youth, Cairo, feel betrayed by the last revolution. That's one consequence. The other is what Steve's last report ended with, which is a very scary prospect for more human rights abuses. We haven't prevented the one in 2007, 2014 in the Somali region. We haven't prevented the Tigray one with a tune of 1 million people dying. We haven't done anything about the Amhara ongoing. And if that continues, then the Oromo human rights abuse would continue. That's the situation. I think, what can we do? I think the US government doesn't realize, in my opinion, and I could be wrong, or it could be intentional. It's not, or I don't know if it's intentional, but the US has not used its soft power as well as, stick. The Ethiopian economy and the budget support that we give to the government of Ethiopia has not been used as a collateral to promote human rights issues. That's how I ended up in my presentation. I don't know what's holding. I think we still, as in America, we are still married to the days we waited till the dictator falls. Our history is replete with helping Mobutu Sese Seko, Hofet Bonye, the who is who of Africa's dictators. And I think even now, Museveni has been there for almost 30 years. It seems that the US strategy is, as long as the dictator stays there, he can be talked to, but he can do whatever, or she, we haven't seen a female dictator yet. But so I think that is arresting US vision. It narrows the US vision when it comes to Africa. It doesn't do any change so far. So I hope we realize that, and we utilize the power that we have. And that's what we have missed in the case of Ethiopia up to now. I am shocked that we are left with one alternative only, and that is to work with this current autocratic system that has the cessation of hostility on the one hand, but it started or beefing up two wars, one in the Amhara region, one in Oromia. So where does that logic really sit? I'm lost.
Thank you so much, Faisal. Michelle, to you and even others in the panel, but I will start with you. Segue from where Faisal has left. What is the process of normalization of relations between the US and the EU with the Ethiopian government? And do you think the process of normalization is underway? And if so, what are the similarities and differences in terms of the approach between the EU and the United States? Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you. Well, I think that it's very much underway. Our European partners are more forward-leaning than the US has been. They're eager to get back to business as usual to some degree, in part, I think, because of concerns about regional instability writ large and the potential for state collapse and mass migration. there is also a strong strain within the US of fear of being left behind, right? As Ethiopia-China relations, which are obviously extremely longstanding and close, there's this sense of if we try to use leverage to achieve specific goals around accountability for atrocities, for example, we'll find ourselves out in the cold. So I think, you know, once again, US policy is struggling with the kind of short-term imperatives versus a long-term strategic approach about what ultimately we want this partnership to look like and what stability really looks like. You know, I think the point about long relationships with leaders who are well past their sell-by date makes sense. And I think that more than anything, it is born of a confusion between political consistency and stability. But obviously, as other speakers have so eloquently established, right, these cycles of repression only feed the kind of root causes of civic violence and instability within Ethiopia itself, and just add new layers to contested history and a sense of unfinished business in various communities. So the difficulty is getting enough focus and attention to have a clear strategic vision and the patience to stick to it, as opposed to doing whatever seems to cause fewest problems this week.
Thank you, Michelle. Adem, I've got a couple of questions for you. Can you speak to the question of marginalization of Amharas that you spoke about, the narrative around there? And also from the audience, given the Fanos crimes of ethnic cleansing in Western Tigray, how can they be held accountable?
Thank you very much. So I think quickly, you know, I was not trying to say that Amharas were especially marginalized. I was trying to contrast the way they are seen. It is a very dominant narrative in Ethiopia. And I think particularly after the start of the war in northern Ethiopia, that was kind of internationalized. But domestically, there is this understanding, the narrative, the historical narrative was that the Amharas were oppressive. But their experience is that certainly before the rise of the EPRF, the current regime, as I said, you know, even though they recognized the government in the sense that it spoke their language, it wrote their language, and all of that, their experience of it was one of marginalization and oppression, just like the rest of the country, minus the linguistic aspect. But particularly in the last 30 years, the sense of marginalization has increased because, as I said, the displacement, you know, because of history, they have expanded, they have settled in other areas of the country, and as a result, they're more vulnerable to identity-based politics, right? Because they are a minority in a lot of these places, so they have been victims of displacement, and the victim would particularly increase, as I said, when the intra-group competition, particularly in Oromia, increases. And so every time there is tension within Oromia between different Oromo groups, often the victimhood of the Amharas increases. So but I think most importantly, particularly in the last 20, 30 years, the sense of marginalization has increased because, as I said, a lot of people are looking at the social development, socio-economic indicators and see, well, in terms of road connection, it is below average. In terms of for instance, access to Addis Ababa and all, there has been problems. And so again, the reality may be more complex, but the perception is one of historically being a victim like everybody else, but being blamed for it, and then increased violence meted out against them in the past years, and particularly since Abiy Ahmed came to power. On the question of Western Tigray, and indeed, I think there is enough evidence that a lot of the violence that was perpetrated by Amhara groups in the area, a lot of the displacement has been there's very little question, I think, in terms of what happened there. Now, what is more complex is the history of it, right? And so, what I think most Amharas or Amhara nationalists will resist is the focus on the timing on that particular incident rather than the story of what has been happening in that region. But and in terms of how to hold them accountable, obviously, I wish there was a genuine transitional justice process that will hold everybody accountable. But as we heard in the first panel, unfortunately, the prospects of all of that happening are very slim. But there's very little question. I mean, we have to see in terms of accountability who did it and all, who ordered it, all of that. But there's very little question, I think, that there was a lot of violence committed in the area, including by Amhara organized groups. And so the manner of it and how and all, it has to be part of the national process. And unfortunately, I think that is facing significant challenge at the moment.
Yeah, thank you so much. Chidi, are you still on the line? Yeah, we've lost Chidi. There was a specific question about the AU that was it would have been good to answer. We're left with a few minutes, maybe 3. I'll give each panel 1 minute to do their closing remarks, and then we bring the panel to an end. Because you are in the room, Faisal, I'll start with you. Some of your closing remarks. 1 minute. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we need to really talk with numbers and matrix, if you will, data. I think marginalization should be talked in the context of what's real and what's not real. For instance, take the Somali region, as I said, who was incorporated in Ethiopia lately in 1954. Less than 1%, and I'm being very generous, speaks the Amharic language. That means they are shut off from all services. 80% of the employees in the federal government are probably Amharic speakers. And take it or divide that in between Amhara, Tigray, and some Oromo. Less than 0.2% of Somalis are in the Ethiopian National Army. I mean, I can go on and on and on. Marginalized, there is no Somali woman who probably holds a position at the federal level, probably with the exception of 2 people. When we talk about marginalization, it's not really having a political contestation over who rules the country. That's the narrative that you hear from the center, as I said earlier. But when you talk about marginalization, the South, the Eastern Oromo in particular, the Somalis, the Afar, the Sidama, they are still as if though they don't belong. Nowadays, you hear in America, really, Trump's voter is saying they are marginalized because they have seen few women taking jobs and some Black people getting some jobs here, and they feel like the white man has been marginalized. That is not marginalization. Marginalization is structural, institutional. And I do disagree with my colleague. I think if there is marginalization, we need to come down to the South. The whole political construct, as I said, of the South is not because they are related with blood. It's because they have no access to the political power and the pie that Ethiopia talks. Now, I like to join what Michelle said in terms of how can we work with what we have right now? Even if the US government says for the short-term gain, we have to really pursue this lame and limping transitional justice that the government is willing to work. I think probably if that's the only alternative we are left with, we need to bring that down to the civic societies, not give the entire process to the hand of the government. You have to understand that Abiy is now claiming, Prime Minister Abiy is claiming to preside over a party that is about 15 million members. This is not a member that you really voluntarily join. These are the government employees, from minister down to cadres. That is what you talk when you talk about the prosperity party. If you leave the transitional justice that we are even saying it's better than nothing, then you are leaving the entire process to an autocratic system whose product can easily be projected and predicted, which is to strengthen the position of the government. So I agree with Michelle and even with the ambassador to an extent. If that's what we are left with, we have to chip off the edges of that process and see the point of entry, bringing down all the way to the lowest level of the communities and the society that we are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal. Over to you, Michelle, and then we'll close with you, Chidi. Sorry, Adil.
I'll be very brief. Two things. One would be to stress the importance of this kind of dialogue and of continuing to force the United States government to articulate its goals and reckon with its policies and deal with the disparities between sort of stated desires for what this bilateral relationship is built on and yields and where we're at right now. It's more important than ever because the sort of list of crises is so long and attention spans are limited, and nothing good comes of letting important policy issues fall off the radar. So it is absolutely critical to find ways to keep surfacing these issues and resist the temptation to say, well, the Tigray crisis is over, and so everything is fine, ignoring, of course, what's happening in Oromia and Amhara and Afar, et cetera, and the unresolved business in Tigray itself. The second thing I would just say is really to reinforce the point that was just made when I think about the limits of what I think the current Ethiopian government is really capable of, and how one builds the context for a more just and sustainable dispensation going forward. It really is about localities, about sort of subnational civil society entities, trying to find ways to engage in dialogue, to understand aspirations, understand red lines, and avoid a situation where, 10 years from now, every different community has a factually different history about what happened in this time period. And that's work that, while dangerous, I suppose in some ways, seems doable right now.
Adem.
I think for me, and obviously I was asked to speak about the issues in Amhara, but the way I understand the problems, they are Ethiopia-wide. I think that at the root of all of this is the inability of the country to generate a more inclusive narrative about the country, in terms of what it tells itself and what it is, and also in terms of building institutions that are acceptable, right? Whether it's in terms of a federal arrangement, local representation, and all of that. And so I think it's a question of building an inclusive narrative and an institutional framework that is necessary to transition the country. Otherwise, if you look at all the problems, whether it's in Oromia or in Somalia or in Amhara, you can give them identity, you can spin them in identity terms, but the root is the same. The oppression, most of the oppression is actually perpetrated by the local branch, the satellites of the central government. So in Somalia, it's often the Somali government itself. In Amhara, it's the Amhara government itself that plays as a proxy to the center and commits most of the violence and the oppression and all. And so the only way I think the situation can be addressed is through a nationwide process. And unfortunately, especially the opposition, I think, had a big chance when Abiy came to power to organize build a genuine coalition. Despite their difference on some policy issues, they could have coalesced around generating a new democratic dispensation. They could have coalesced around, building an independent, autonomous administration, and all of that. And so, again, I think ultimately that is where the key lies. And of course, it's good to have the Americans and the Europeans and all help us. But I really have sincere doubts about their capacity and their willingness to both to understand what is happening in these places and then much less to provide responses to. And so, as Abadr said, if some of the legitimation and all can cause harm, but in terms of expecting too much, I think, unfortunately, I think it's founded on the idea that the West has a good sense of what is happening in this place, and I really, really sincerely doubt that they have. And so, primarily, it has to be a domestic process. And as I said, a coalition of Democrats from opposition parties, religious institutions, business people, everybody really has to focus on a few themes of building democracy and rule of law. And then perhaps the Europeans and the Americans could support. But if the internal coherence is not there, I very much doubt that the Americans in the West will make any difference.
On that note, I want to thank all the panelists. Discussing Ethiopia, even in the best of times, is always very fraught. Thank you so much for engaging with the issue and each other in a very, extremely professional ways. And for the audience, both who are in the room, thank you. And those online, thank you. We couldn't answer all the questions, but I think we tried to surface some of the questions. Hopefully this is one of, many events like this to discuss Ethiopia and its place in the region. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.